Sometimes the hardest truths are the ones we've spent our whole lives running from. For 58-year-old Abram Lapp, 30 years of guilt and grief have shaped every quiet day on his Pennsylvania farm. He's lived simply since losing his younger brother during their rumspringa, that painful chapter, when Amish youth experienced the outside world. The accident that took his brother's life brought Abram home to his faith forever. He never speaks of it, never questions what happened that terrible night. But on a foggy autumn morning, Abram pulls a weathered red barrel from the river. Inside, he finds old photographs, English clothes, and a journal written in his dead brother's hand. The entries tell a different story than the one Abram has carried all these years. What if everything he believed about his brother's death was a lie? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rooster's crow pierced the pre-dawn silence as it had for 30 years, calling Abram Lapp from dreams he rarely remembered. He sat on the edge of his bed, bare feet touching the cool wooden floor his grandfather had laid with his own hands. The house breathed around him, old timber settling, Martha's gentle breathing beside him, the whisper of October wind through the eaves. At 58, Abram's body carried the honest wear of a man who had worked with his hands since boyhood. His shoulders bore the slight forward curve of countless hours bent over workbenches, his palms marked by decades of wood grain and calluses. Grey threaded through his brown beard like frost on autumn grass, and his blue eyes held the quiet depth that came from years of careful observation. He dressed in the darkness, pulling on his broad-fall trousers and plain shirt with the practiced efficiency of routine. The wooden cross he had carved for Samuel's grave 30 years ago sat on his dresser, worn smooth by his fingers during moments of remembrance. He touched it briefly, a ritual as automatic as breathing, before making his way downstairs. The kitchen welcomed him with familiar shadows and the lingering scent of yesterday's bread. Martha had set out his clothes the night before, as she always did. His work boots waited by the door, leather softened by years of faithful service. Outside, his draft horses nickered in anticipation of morning feeding, their breath visible in the crisp air. Abram lit the oil lamp and began his morning prayers, speaking the German words his father had taught him, and his father's father before that. The prayers felt solid in his mouth, anchoring him to something larger than his own small concerns. When he finished, he stepped outside into the grey pre-dawn world. The farm spread before him in gentle rolls of pasture and woodland, 180 acres that had supported 3 generations of Lapps. His great-grandfather had cleared this land with axe and ox, stone by stubborn stone. The barn his father built still stood strong against time and weather, its red paint faded, but its bones true. Everything here spoke of permanence, of roots that ran deep into Pennsylvania soil. In the barn, his horses greeted him with soft wickers. Patience and steadfast, names that reflected Amish values, pressed their great heads against his chest as he scratched behind their ears. Their warmth and trust always moved him. Animals, he had long believed, possessed a honesty that humans too often lacked. "Good morning, old friends," he murmured, measuring out their grain. "Another day the Lord has made." As he worked, his mind drifted to Samuel, as it often did in these quiet morning moments. His younger brother would have been 55 now, perhaps with grandchildren of his own. Would he have stayed on the family farm, married within the community? The questions were familiar visitors, worn smooth by 3 decades of wondering. Samuel had been different from the start, quicker to laugh, slower to accept simple answers. Where Abram found comfort in tradition, Samuel chafed against boundaries. Even as boys, Samuel had peppered their father with questions that made the old man frown. Why do the English dress different? Why can't we have electricity? What's beyond the next county? Their father, Eli Lapp, had been a stern man who believed questions led to doubt, and doubt led to spiritual ruin. The old ways are the true ways, he would say, ending discussions with the finality of a closing door. But Samuel's curiosity had been like water against stone, patient, persistent, eventually finding every crack. The rumspringa had been Samuel's undoing, that blessed and cursed tradition that allowed Amish youth to experience the outside world before choosing their faith had called to Samuel like a siren song. At 19, he had left their community with a group of friends, planning to spend a few months sampling English life before returning to take his vows. Abram, 2 years older and already baptized, had watched his brother leave with a heart full of foreboding. Something in Samuel's eyes had looked too eager, too hungry for whatever lay beyond their peaceful valley. "I'll be back by Christmas," Samuel had promised, embracing Abram at the bus station. "Don't worry, brother. I just need to see for myself." Christmas had come and gone. Samuel sent letters at first, brief notes assuring them he was well, working construction jobs, staying with friends. The letters grew shorter, then stopped altogether. Their parents had waited, prayed, hoped. Abram had driven to Lancaster twice, asking questions among the English. But Samuel seemed to have vanished into that vast world beyond their understanding. Then came the phone call on a February night that changed everything. The hospital in Philadelphia had found their information in Samuel's wallet. There had been an accident. Samuel was gone. Abram remembered the ride to the city, sitting beside his father in hired English car while snow fell beyond the windows. The hospital had been a maze of harsh lights and antiseptic smells. A tired doctor had explained that Samuel had been found in the Schuylkill River, apparently the victim of a fall. Perhaps he had been drinking. Perhaps he had simply slipped on ice-covered rocks. The river had been unkind to him. They had brought Samuel home in a plain wooden coffin Abram had built with his own hands, every nail driven with grief and love. The funeral had been simple, as was their way. Samuel was buried in the small cemetery behind their church, under a marker bearing only his name and dates. No elaborate words, no grand memorial, just Samuel Lapp, 1970-1990, in God's hands. The wooden cross had come later, carved in Abram's workshop during long winter evenings when grief sat heavy in his chest. He had worked the cherry wood with infinite care, sanding it smooth as silk, rubbing it with oil until it glowed like honey in lamplight. Martha had found him there one night, tears falling onto the wood as he worked. "It's beautiful," she had whispered, her hand on his shoulder. "He deserved better than that bare marker," Abram had replied. He deserved to be remembered. The cross had stood over Samuel's grave for 30 years now, weathered by rain and sun, but still strong. Abram visited it every week, usually on Sundays after church. He would pull the weeds that dared to grow there, straighten the earth around its base, and speak to his brother in quiet tones about the week's events, the changing seasons. The children Samuel would never know. His own children had grown up hearing stories of their uncle, carefully edited stories that spoke of Samuel's kindness, his quick wit, his skill with horses. Rebecca, now 28, and married to a good man from a neighboring district, sometimes asked why Uncle Samuel had left their community. Abram always gave the same answer. He was young and curious. Sometimes young people need to see what else is out there before they appreciate what they have at home. Jacob, 25 and still unmarried despite his mother's gentle urgings, had inherited something of Samuel's restless spirit. He asked harder questions, pushed boundaries in small ways that reminded Abram painfully of his brother. Last month, Jacob had suggested they might try using solar panels for the workshop, a notion that had scandalized Martha and earned a sharp rebuke from the bishop. But Abram had seen Samuel's curiosity burning in his son's eyes, and it both thrilled and terrified him. The morning routine continued with comforting predictability. Abram fed the chickens, collected the eggs, checked the vegetable garden where Martha's late tomatoes still clung to their vines. The workshop called to him. 3 kitchen cabinets waiting for their final sanding, a rocking chair that needed its joints adjusted. His hands itched for the familiar weight of his tools, the satisfaction of shaping wood into something useful and beautiful. Martha emerged from the house as he finished the barn chores, her grey dress neat, her prayer cap precisely positioned. After 32 years of marriage, she moved through their shared routines with an efficiency born of deep familiarity. She knew he would want his coffee black, his eggs over easy, his toast lightly browned. She knew he would read from the martyr's mirror while he ate, as his father had done before him. "The miller's baby has the croup," she said, settling into her chair across from him. "Sarah asked if I might bring some of my honey remedy." "Of course," Abram replied, though his attention was divided. Something felt different about this morning, though he couldn't name what it was. A restlessness in the air, perhaps, or simply the changing season. October always made him melancholy, reminded him too keenly of that last autumn when Samuel was still alive, still writing those brief, increasingly distant letters. Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her own baby on her hip. Little Martha, named for her grandmother, gurgled and reached for Abram with chubby fingers. At 10 months old, she was the joy of his later years, a bright star in the constellation of his contentment. "Good morning, Dat," Rebecca said, kissing his cheek before settling the baby in his arms. "Jacob's already in the workshop. He has ideas about that chest you're building for the Kaufmans." Abram nodded, inhaling the sweet scent of his granddaughter's hair. This was his world. Family, faith, the work of his hands, the rhythms of the seasons. It was a good life, a blessed life. He had built it carefully on the foundation of loss. Learning to find joy again after sorrow nearly broke him. But even as he held his granddaughter close, even as Martha hummed softly while preparing breakfast, even as the familiar sounds of his family's morning filled the kitchen, something whispered at the edges of his consciousness. A sense of things shifting, of change approaching on the autumn wind. He shook off the feeling and focused on little Martha's bright eyes, letting her tiny fingers wrap around his calloused thumb. Whatever shadows the day might bring, he would meet them as he always had, with faith, with family, with the quiet strength that had carried him through 30 years of missing his brother. The workshop waited. The wood waited. The day waited. And somewhere in the back of his mind, barely acknowledged, something else waited too, patient as stone, inevitable as winter, ready to surface when the time was right. The fog lay thick on the river that morning, turning the familiar creek that bordered Abram's property into something from another world. He had walked down to check his fishing nets, a simple pleasure he allowed himself on quiet Saturday mornings when the workshop could wait. The water moved slowly here, pooling in a deep bend, where trout liked to rest in the summer heat. Something red caught his eye through the mist, lodged against the fallen oak that had anchored his nets for the past 5 years. At first, he thought it might be debris from upstream, perhaps a cooler lost by English fishermen or refuse that had floated down from Lancaster County. But as he waded closer, his boots squelching in the muddy bottom, he saw it was older than that. The barrel was metal, once bright red, but now faded to the color of dried blood. Rust streaked its sides like tears, and rivergrass had begun to grow around its base. It looked as though it had been there for years, decades even, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Recent rains had raised the water level, shifting the sandbar that had kept it hidden. Abram tried to lift it, and immediately understood why the river had held it so long. The barrel was heavy, full of something that shifted with a wet, muffled sound when he rocked it. He managed to drag it to the bank, his muscles straining against the weight and his own reluctance. Something about the barrel felt wrong, ominous, like a grave marker that had broken free from hallowed ground. He should have left it there, should have pushed it back into the current and let the river reclaim its secret. But curiosity, that dangerous inheritance from his brother, compelled him to work at the rusted lid with a piece of driftwood, until it finally gave way with a groan of protesting metal. The smell hit him. First, not decay as he had feared, but something else. Leather and fabric, old paper and metal, all wrapped in the particular mustiness of things long submerged. Abram peered into the barrel's dark mouth and saw shapes wrapped in what looked like oiled cloth, the kind hunters used to protect their gear. His hands shook as he reached for the first bundle. The cloth fell away to reveal clothing, English clothing, blue jeans and flannel shirts, a leather jacket cracked with age but still recognizable. Beneath the clothes, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, were photographs. The first photograph stopped his heart. Samuel stared back at him from across 30 years. But this was not the Samuel of Abram's memories. This Samuel wore English clothes and stood beside a red pickup truck, his arm around a young woman with brown hair and kind eyes. He was smiling, not the careful, controlled smile appropriate for Amish photographs, but a wide, joyful grin that Abram had forgotten his brother possessed. With trembling fingers, Abram sorted through more pictures. Samuel at what looked like a construction site, hard hat tilted back, laughing with English co-workers. Samuel and the same brown-haired woman at a fair, sharing cotton candy. Samuel holding a baby, a little boy with Samuel's eyes and the woman's gentle mouth. The world seemed to tilt around Abram. His brother had not, simply been experimenting with English life during his rumspringa. These photographs spoke of relationships, of a life built beyond their community's borders. The dates on the backs of the photos, written in Samuel's familiar handwriting, showed they had been taken over months, perhaps longer. But it was the journal that destroyed everything Abram thought he knew, wrapped in layers of plastic and cloth. The leather-bound book had survived its long submersion remarkably well. Samuel's name was embossed on the cover in gold letters that had faded but not disappeared. Inside, page after page of his brother's careful script told a story that made Abram's knees weak. March 15, 1989. Sarah and I talked about getting married today. I know what Dad would say, what the bishop would say, but I can't imagine going back to that life now. Not after finding this love, this freedom to be who I really am. April 3rd, 1989. The baby is due in October. Sarah wants to name him David if it's a boy. I lie awake at night thinking about teaching him to fish, to throw a baseball, to fix engines. All the things Dad never had time for. All the things our community says don't matter. June 12th, 1989. Abram wrote again asking when I'm coming home. How can I explain that home isn't a place anymore? Home is Sarah's laugh when I tell her about my day. Home is the way she sings while she cooks. Home is imagining our son's first steps, first words. Each entry was a knife thrust into Abram's understanding of the past. Samuel had not been lost or confused during his rumspringa. He had been building a new life, finding love, preparing to become a father. The brother Abram had mourned as a victim of English temptation, had instead been a man making conscious choices about his future. October 20th, 1989. David was born today. 7 pounds 3 ounces, perfect in every way. When I held him, I knew I could never go back. This is my family now. This is my real life. December 1st, 1989, got another letter from home. Dad threatens to shun me if I don't return by Christmas. He doesn't understand that he's already lost me. I stopped being his son the day I chose love over fear. The final entries were different, darker in tone. January 15th, 1990. Someone from home has been asking questions about me in town. Sarah is worried. Maybe we should move further away, start fresh where no one can find us. February 10th, 1990. They found us. Dad and Bishop Miller came to the apartment today. They want me to come home, leave Sarah and David behind like they never existed. I told them I'd rather die first. The last entry was dated February 14th, 1990, 3 days before the phone call that had shattered Abram's world. February 14th, 1990. Met Abram at the old bridge tonight. Tried to make him understand, but he kept talking about duty and forgiveness and coming home. He doesn't see that I am home. I am where I belong. Tomorrow, Sarah and I are taking David and driving west. We'll start over in Oregon, maybe California. Somewhere they can't follow, can't hurt us anymore. Abram read the entry 3 times before its meaning penetrated his shock. Samuel had not died alone, had not been drunk and careless by the river. He had planned to leave with his family, to build a life beyond anyone's reach. And Abram had been there that night, had met his brother at the bridge, but that was impossible. Abram remembered that night clearly. He had been home with Martha, who was pregnant with Rebecca. He remembered the call from the hospital, remembered the drive to Philadelphia, remembered identifying Samuel's body. He had never met his brother at any bridge, had he? The fog seemed to press closer around him as fragments of memory stirred like sediment disturbed from a riverbed. A night drive through falling snow. Voices raised in argument. The sound of rushing water. His father's voice, low and urgent. No one must know. No one must ever know. Abram's hands shook so violently he nearly dropped the journal. There were gaps in his memory of that time, places where grief and shock had blurred the edges of events. But now, reading Samuel's words, other memories began to surface. Darker memories that had been buried so deep he had convinced himself they were dreams. The sound of his father's voice. He's chosen his path. We must choose ours. The weight of something heavy in his arms, the splash of water closing over. No, the word escaped his lips as a whisper. Then louder. No, that didn't happen. But even as he denied it, the pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The family meeting he had forgotten. The drive through the night. His father's grim determination and the bishop's prayers for a son who had already been declared dead to them. Abram stumbled backward from the barrel, his breakfast rising in his throat. Samuel had not died in an accident. He had died because he had chosen love over duty, freedom over tradition. And somehow, God help him, Abram had been there when it happened, the photographs scattered in the wind, but he clutched the journal to his chest like a lifeline. 30 years of grief and guilt suddenly made terrible sense. He had not been mourning his brother's tragic accident. He had been carrying the weight of something much worse. The fog began to lift, revealing the familiar landscape of his property, his barn, his house, his life built on foundations that were crumbling beneath his feet. Martha would be starting breakfast soon, expecting him to return with fish for their Saturday meal. Rebecca would bring the baby by after lunch. Jacob would want help with the cabinet project. His normal life waited, but Abram understood with crystalline certainty that nothing would ever be normal again. The barrel had given back more than Samuel's possessions. It had returned 30 years of buried truth, and that truth was going to destroy everything he had built on its grave. Abram sat in his workshop until the sun climbed high enough to burn away the morning fog. Samuel's journal pressed between his palms like a prayer book. The familiar sounds of his family preparing for the day drifted from the house, Martha humming as she kneaded bread, Rebecca's gentle voice talking to the baby, Jacob's boots on the porch steps. Normal sounds for a normal Saturday, but they seemed to come from another world now. He had hidden the barrel behind the tool shed, covering it with an old tarp. The photographs were tucked inside the journal, except for one, the picture of Samuel with the woman and baby, which he kept turning over in his fingers as if it might reveal different truths with each viewing. The baby had Samuel's eyes. There was no doubt about that. A grandson he had never known existed. A daughter-in-law who had loved his brother enough to build a life with him outside everything they had been taught to value. Abram tried to imagine what that must have been like for Samuel, choosing between the world he had known and the world he had discovered, between duty and desire, between the family that had raised him and the family he wanted to create. Dat? Jacob's voice from the workshop doorway made Abram quickly close the journal. His son stood silhouetted against the morning light, concern evident in his posture. "Mam's been calling you for breakfast. Are you feeling well?" "Just thinking," Abram managed, though his voice sounded strange even to himself. "About that cabinet project, some complications I need to work through." Jacob stepped closer, and Abram saw too much of Samuel in his son's questioning gaze. The same intelligent eyes, the same slight tilt of the head when something didn't make sense. "What kind of complications?" "Nothing that can't be sorted." Abram stood, slipping the journal into his tool chest with practiced casualness. "Tell your mother I'll be in shortly." But Jacob didn't move. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Dat." The words hit closer to truth than his son could know. In a way, Abram had seen a ghost, or perhaps discovered that what he thought was a ghost had actually been a man whose life had been stolen from him. "I'm fine, son. Just tired." That night, after Martha had fallen asleep beside him, Abram lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams his grandfather had hewn from trees that had grown on this very land. Everything in this house spoke of continuity, of generations living and dying in harmony with tradition. But Samuel had seen those same beams and felt trapped by them. Abram tried to remember his brother as he truly had been, not as grief and time had transformed him in memory. Samuel had always asked questions, not rebellious questions, but genuine curiosity about the world beyond their valley. Why did the English build such tall buildings? What was it like to travel in airplanes? Why couldn't women be ministers if they had the calling? Their father had silenced such questions with increasing harshness as Samuel grew older. Idle curiosity leads to temptation, Eli would say. A man who keeps his mind on his work and his heart on God has no time for wondering about things that don't concern him. But Samuel's curiosity had been like a fire that burned brighter when smothered. Even as a child, he had climbed to the highest branches of their oak trees, trying to see what lay beyond the next hill. He had befriended English children when their family went to market, asking them about their schools, their games, their different way of life. Now Abram understood that curiosity had been more than youthful restlessness. It had been Samuel's true nature asserting itself against the constraints of their community. And when Rumspringa had given him permission to explore that world, he had found something worth staying for. The photograph of Samuel with his family haunted Abram's dreams. In it, his brother looked genuinely happy, not the careful contentment that was appropriate for Amish life, but a deep, radiating joy that transformed his entire face. When had Abram last felt such joy? When had he last seen it in anyone within their community? Sunday brought its own challenges. Abram sat through the 3-hour service in the miller's barn, but the familiar rhythms of worship felt distant and hollow. When Bishop Miller preached about the dangers of worldly temptation, about the importance of staying separate from English corruption, Abram found himself thinking of Samuel's journal entries. His brother had not been corrupted by the outside world. He had been freed by it. The realization was both terrifying and oddly liberating. After the service, during the shared meal, Abram found himself studying the faces around him. The men discussing crop prices and weather patterns. The women tending to children and sharing quiet gossip. The teenagers sneaking glances at each other across the careful boundaries of courtship. All of it suddenly seemed like an elaborate performance, a dance choreographed by fear rather than faith. "You're quiet today," Martha observed as they rode home in their buggy. Little Martha dozed between them, her head resting against her grandmother's arm. Thinking about the Kaufman cabinet? Abram lied, the deception bitter on his tongue. 32 years of marriage. And this was the first time he could remember deliberately misleading his wife about something important. But how could he tell her the truth? How could he explain that everything they had built together was founded on a lie? That the brother they had mourned for 30 years might still be alive if different choices had been made that February night. Monday brought visitors that made Abram's blood run cold. Bishop Miller and 2 of the community elders arrived just as Abram was finishing his morning chores. Their expressions were grave, their purpose unmistakably serious. "We need to speak with you, Abram," the bishop said without preamble. "There are concerns about your state of mind lately." They gathered in the kitchen, Martha serving coffee with hands that trembled slightly. She knew, as they all did, that visits from church leadership rarely brought good news. "You seemed distracted during worship yesterday," Elder Yoder observed. "Distant, as if your mind was elsewhere. Your son Jacob mentioned you've been behaving strangely," added Elder Stoltzfus. "Spending time alone, looking troubled. Is there something weighing on your spirit that you need to confess?" Abram met their concerned gazes and felt the weight of the journal hidden in his workshop like a stone in his chest. These men had been his spiritual guides for decades. He had trusted their wisdom, followed their counsel, built his life according to their teachings. But now he wondered what else they might know, what other truths they might have helped bury. "I've been thinking about Samuel lately," he said carefully. The anniversary of his death approaches, and sometimes the grief returns unexpectedly. The bishop nodded with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. Grief can be a burden that grows heavier with time rather than lighter. Perhaps you should spend more time in prayer, less time alone with your thoughts. Sometimes, Elder Yoder added gently, it's best not to dwell too deeply on matters that can't be changed. The past is in God's hands. Our duty is to the present, to our families and community. Their words carried an undertone that made Abram's skin prickle. Were they simply offering pastoral comfort, or was there a warning hidden in their counsel? Did they somehow know about the barrel, about what he had discovered? Of course, Abram replied. You're right. I should focus on my blessings rather than old sorrows. But even as he spoke the expected words, his resolve was hardening. Samuel's journal had opened a door that could not be closed again. Whatever the truth was about that February night 30 years ago, Abram was going to find it, even if it destroyed everything he had built on its foundations. The journey into Lancaster took every ounce of courage Abram possessed. He had not driven beyond their immediate district in over a decade, and sitting in the hired English car felt like crossing into enemy territory. The driver, a kind man named Tom, who often provided transportation for the Amish community, made gentle conversation about the weather and crop prices, but Abram could barely focus on the words. In his jacket pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay the hospital bracelet he had found in the barrel that morning. White plastic, yellowed with age, bearing Samuel's name and a date that changed everything. February 17th, 1990. 3 days after his brother's final journal entry, and 1 day after the hospital had called to report Samuel's death. If Samuel had been admitted to the hospital on the 17th, then he could not have died on the 14th, as Abram had always believed. Someone had lied about when Samuel died. Someone had altered the timeline, and Abram had a terrible suspicion about who and why. Lancaster General Hospital rose before them like a monument to English efficiency, all glass and steel where Amish buildings were wood and stone. Inside, the fluorescent lights made Abram squint, and the antiseptic smell brought back unwelcome memories of that awful night 30 years ago when he had identified his brother's body. I'm looking for information about a patient from 1990, he told the receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes who seemed genuinely eager to help. My brother, Samuel Lapp. He was brought here in February. The computer search took nearly an hour, involving several staff members and multiple phone calls to archives. Finally, a supervisor emerged with a manila folder that looked as old as the memories it contained. Mr. Lapp, she said carefully, I can share some basic information, but our records from that time period are limited. Your brother was indeed a patient here, admitted on February 15th with severe hypothermia and internal injuries consistent with a fall. He was conscious when brought in. Conscious. The word hit Abram like a physical blow. How long was he here? According to this, he was here for 2 days before. She consulted the file. Before he passed on the 17th. I'm sorry for your loss. 2 days. Samuel had been alive for 2 days, and no one from the family had been notified until after he was already dead. Abram's hands shook as he signed the papers requesting copies of what records could legally be released to next of kin. The drive back to the farm passed in a blur of conflicting emotions. Anger at being deceived, grief for opportunities lost, and underneath it all, a growing certainty that Samuel's death had been no accident. That evening, Rebecca came for dinner with her husband David and little Martha. The conversation flowed around Abram like water around a stone. Discussions of harvest preparations, community news, plans for the upcoming barn raising at the Fisher farm. Normal family life continuing while his understanding of the past crumbled. You're quiet tonight, Dad, Rebecca observed, cutting her meat with careful precision. Are you feeling well? Before Abram could answer, Jacob spoke up. He's been strange all week, distracted. This morning I found him just standing in the workshop, staring at nothing. Perhaps you should see Dr. Morgan, Martha suggested, her voice carrying the particular worry of a wife who had watched her husband struggle with something beyond her understanding. You've been different since—" She paused, glancing at their children. "Since you've been thinking about Samuel again." The mention of his brother's name created one of those silences that fall over Amish families when painful topics surface. Samuel's death was acknowledged but rarely discussed, filed away with other griefs too deep for casual conversation. But tonight, Abram found himself unable to let the moment pass. "What do you remember about Uncle Samuel?" he asked Rebecca suddenly. She looked surprised by the direct question. "Not much. I was very young when he died. I remember you and Mam being very sad, and Grostadi's face at the funeral." "Why do you ask?" "I've been wondering what he might have become if he had lived. What kind of man he would have been." David, Rebecca's husband, shifted uncomfortably. Such speculation was not encouraged in their community. Dwelling on what might have been was considered a form of prideful questioning of God's will. "Samuel was young and foolish," Martha said firmly. "He thought the English world could offer him something better than the life God had given him. His death was a tragedy, but also a reminder of why we stay separate from worldly temptations." Was it, though? The words escaped before Abram could stop them. "A reminder, I mean. How do we know what really happened to him?" The silence that followed was different from before, charged with tension and unspoken warnings. Jacob looked fascinated by this unusual display of questioning from his typically conventional father. Rebecca appeared worried. David seemed scandalized. "Abram," Martha said quietly, but with steel beneath the softness. "What are you saying?" He looked around the table at these people he loved more than his own life. His wife of 3 decades. His daughter, who had inherited his steady hands and generous heart. His son-in-law, who worked their land with devotion and skill. His son, who carried just enough of Samuel's questioning spirit to make Abram proud and nervous in equal measure. They had built this life together on foundations Abram had thought were solid. But those foundations were shifting beneath them, and soon they would all have to choose between comfortable lies and dangerous truths. "I'm saying that sometimes we accept what we're told without asking enough questions," he replied carefully. "Sometimes the truth is more complicated than the stories we tell ourselves." After they left, Martha confronted him in their bedroom. "What's happening to you, Abram? This isn't like you, questioning the church, questioning the community's understanding of Samuel's death. Where is this coming from?" He sat on the edge of their bed, looking at his hands, the same hands that had built this house, carved Samuel's cross, held his children and grandchildren, shaped wood into beautiful and useful things for 30 years. Honest hands that now felt stained by secrets he was only beginning to understand. "I found something," he said finally. "Something that suggests Samuel's death wasn't what we were told it was." Martha's face went very still. "What kind of something?" Abram studied his wife's expression, looking for signs that she might know more than she had ever let on. But he saw only genuine confusion and growing fear, evidence that he didn't die when they said he did, that there are pieces of the story we were never told. "Abram." Martha sat beside him, taking his hands in hers. "Samuel died 30 years ago. We grieved him, we buried him, we moved on with our lives. Whatever you think you found, it can't change what happened. It can only hurt the people who love you now." Her words carried the weight of practical wisdom earned through 3 decades of marriage and motherhood. She had watched him struggle with Samuel's death, had helped him build a new life on the ashes of that grief. The idea of reopening those wounds terrified her, but Abram couldn't let it go. The hospital bracelet in his pocket felt like a lead weight, and Samuel's journal, hidden in his workshop, called to him like a voice from the grave. "What if someone in our community lied to us about how he died?" he asked quietly. "What if people we trust, people we've followed for 30 years, covered up the truth about what happened to my brother?" Martha's hands tightened on his. "Even if that were true, and I'm not saying it is, what good would digging it up do now? Samuel is still dead. The people who might have lied are mostly gone too. Your father, Bishop Weaver, most of the elders from that time, they've all passed on. All you'll accomplish is destroying the peace we've worked so hard to build." She was right, of course. The logical, practical part of Abram's mind acknowledged the wisdom in her words. But another part, the part that shared Samuel's curiosity, his need for truth regardless of consequences, couldn't accept comfortable lies anymore. "I have to know," he said simply. "I have to know what really happened to him." Martha was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the lamplight. Finally she sighed, a sound that carried 30 years of loving a man whose depth she was still discovering. "Then find out," she said. "But remember that some truths are too heavy to carry alone. And some truths change everything, whether we want them to or not." Finding Sarah Brennan took 3 days, and every favor Abram could call in from the English community. The address in Samuel's journal led to an apartment building that had been torn down years ago, but a helpful clerk at the county records office traced property transfers and voter registrations until she found a current address. In a suburb 20 miles from Lancaster, the house was small but well kept, with flower boxes under the windows and a garden that spoke of patient, loving care. A mailbox at the curb read S. Brennan, and Abram sat in Tom's hired car for 10 minutes, gathering courage before finally walking up the concrete path to the front door. The woman who answered his knock was older now, her brown hair streaked with silver and lines around her eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. But even 30 years later, Abram recognized her immediately from Samuel's photographs. She had the same gentle expression, the same kindness in her gaze that his brother had captured with his camera. "Yes?" she said, and then stopped, her hand tightening on the doorframe. "Oh my God, you're Samuel's brother." "You're Sarah," Abram replied, though it wasn't really a question. Even if he hadn't recognized her face, he would have known her by the way her eyes filled with tears at the mention of Samuel's name. Abram. She spoke his name like a prayer, like something she had carried in her heart for 30 years. "He talked about you so much. I feel like I know you." She invited him in, and they sat in her living room surrounded by the comfortable clutter of a life well lived. Photographs covered the mantelpiece, family gatherings, graduations, weddings, grandchildren. But Abram's eyes were drawn to one picture that seemed out of place among the modern color prints. An old black and white photograph of Samuel holding a baby, his face radiant with joy. "That's David when he was 6 months old," Sarah said, following his gaze. Samuel was so proud of him. He said he was going to teach him everything: how to fish, how to fix cars, how to be a good man in a complicated world. "Where is David now?" Abram asked, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "He's a teacher in Philadelphia, married with 2 children of his own. He has Samuel's eyes and his stubborn streak too." Sarah smiled, but the expression was shadowed with old pain. "He's always wondered about his father's family, about why no one ever came looking for him." The words hit Abram like physical blows. A nephew who had grown up wondering about them. Grandchildren he didn't know existed. A whole branch of the family tree that had been severed and left to grow wild. "We didn't know," he said. "We didn't know about you, about David. We were told Samuel died alone, that he had been drinking and fell into the river." Sarah's face hardened. "Samuel never drank alcohol, not once in the 2 years I knew him. He said it reminded him too much of some of the English kids during his rumspringa who used it to numb themselves to how lost they felt." She stood and went to an old wooden chest in the corner of the room, returning with a shoebox filled with letters and photographs. "These are the letters Samuel wrote to you and your family. He wrote one every week for months, trying to explain his choice, trying to make you understand that he wasn't rejecting you. He was just choosing a different path." Abram's hands shook as he opened the first letter. Dated just a month after Samuel had left for his rumspringa. "Dear Abram, I know you're worried about me, and I'm sorry for that. But I've found something here that I never knew I was missing. Her name is Sarah, and she sees me, really sees me, in a way I've never been seen before. Not as Eli Lapp's second son or the boy who asks too many questions, but as Samuel, just Samuel. And for the first time in my life, that feels like enough." Letter after letter revealed Samuel's struggle to maintain connection with his family while building a new life. He wrote about his work, his growing love for Sarah, his joy when he learned they were going to have a child. He pleaded for understanding, for acceptance, for a chance to prove that love could bridge the gap between their two worlds. "Did any of these ever reach your family?" Sarah asked. Abram shook his head, his throat too tight for words. Someone had intercepted Samuel's letters, ensuring that his attempts to maintain connection never reached their intended recipients. His brother had died believing his family had rejected him, while they had mourned him, believing he had rejected them. "What happened that night?" Abram finally managed to ask. "The night he died?" Sarah's composure cracked, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. "Your father and the bishop came to our apartment. They'd tracked us down somehow, found where we were living. They demanded that Samuel come home, said he was bringing shame on the family name by living in sin with an English woman." She wiped her eyes with a tissue, struggling to continue. "Samuel tried to explain that we were married. We'd had a civil ceremony the month before David was born. But they said it wasn't a real marriage in God's eyes, that his only choice was to abandon us and return to the community or be cut off forever." "What did Samuel say?" "He told them he'd already made his choice, that you were his brother in blood, but David was his son in love, and love was stronger than blood. He said he'd rather lose his family than betray his own heart." Sarah pulled out a small white object from the shoebox, a hospital bracelet, identical to the one Abram carried in his pocket. They brought him back 3 days later, beaten and barely alive. The police said he'd been found by the river, but Samuel was conscious for a few hours before he died. He kept saying your name, Abram, over and over. "Tell Abram I'm sorry. Tell Abram I loved him. Tell Abram to take care of Sarah and David." The room seemed to spin around Abram. He was alive when they brought him to the hospital. For 2 days. He had internal bleeding they couldn't stop, and hypothermia from being in the water so long. But he was coherent enough to make me promise that I'd tell David about his family someday, about the good man his uncle was. Sarah reached across the table and took Abram's hands in hers. "He never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping you'd understand. Even at the end, even after what they did to him, he didn't blame you. He blamed himself for not being brave enough to fight for both families." Abram felt 30 years of grief and guilt reshaping itself into something far more terrible. The understanding that Samuel's death had not been an accident or even a tragedy of misguided choices. It had been a murder disguised as divine justice, carried out by men who valued control more than love, tradition more than truth. David Lapp, Abram reminded himself, lived in a narrow row house in Philadelphia's Northern Liberties neighborhood. The building was over 100 years old, with brick walls and tall windows that let in streams of afternoon light. Sarah had called ahead, preparing her son for a visit from the uncle he had never met but always wondered about. Abram stood on the front steps for several minutes before knocking, studying the small details that revealed how his nephew lived. A bicycle chained to the front railing, flower pots on the window ledges, carefully tended despite the urban setting. A small sign by the door that read, "The Brennan Family," though Abram wondered if David had ever considered taking his father's surname. The man who opened the door was unmistakably Samuel's son. He had the same intelligent blue eyes, the same slight build, the same way of tilting his head when considering something new. But where Samuel had moved with the careful restraint taught by Amish culture, David carried himself with the confident ease of someone who had never been taught to hide his curiosity about the world. "Uncle Abram," David said, and the word sounded strange coming from a stranger's mouth. "I've wondered about this moment my entire life." They shook hands, and Abram felt the calluses of a man who worked with his hands, though differently than an Amish craftsman would. David taught high school shop class, Sarah had explained, helping teenagers learn to build and fix things, just as Samuel had once dreamed of teaching his son. Inside, the house was warm and lived in, filled with the comfortable chaos of a family with young children. A woman appeared from the kitchen, flour dusting her apron and a shy smile on her face. "This is my wife, Jennifer," David said. And somewhere around here are our kids. Emma's 8 and Sam is 5. Sam, named for the grandfather. He had never known. The children emerged from their playroom with the cautious curiosity of young ones meeting a stranger their parents treated as important. Emma had Samuel's eyes and a face that reminded Abram of his own Rebecca at that age. Little Sam hung back behind his father's legs, studying Abram with an intensity that was purely Lapp. "Are you really our great-uncle?" Emma asked with the directness of childhood. "I am," Abram replied, crouching down to her level. "And you're my great-niece, which makes you very special indeed." Over dinner, David shared the story of growing up as Samuel Lapp's son. Sarah had told him about his father from the beginning, not fairy tales or sanitized versions, but the truth about a young man who had chosen love over duty and paid the ultimate price for that choice. "She never spoke badly about your family," David said, passing a plate of roast chicken that reminded Abram of countless Sunday dinners at home. "She always said you were good people caught in a bad situation. That my father's death was the result of rigid thinking, not evil hearts, but you were angry," Abram observed, seeing it in the careful way David spoke about the past. "For a long time, yes. Especially as a teenager, when I started asking harder questions about why no one from the Amish side of my family had ever tried to find me. I went through a phase where I researched your community, your beliefs, trying to understand how people who preached love and forgiveness could abandon a child simply because his father had made different choices." David's wife Jennifer reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture of support that spoke of many conversations about this painful topic. "But as I got older, especially after Emma was born, I began to understand how complicated family loyalty can be. How people can do terrible things while believing they're protecting what they love most." Abram thought of his own children, of the community that had shaped every decision he had ever made, of the weight of tradition and expectation that pressed down on every Amish family. Would he have been strong enough to make Samuel's choice if faced with the same circumstances? "Your father loved you very much," Abram said quietly. "I read his journal. Every entry was full of plans for your future, dreams of the man you would become." "I'd like to see that journal sometime," David replied, "if you're willing to share it." After dinner, they moved to the living room where David showed Abram photo albums documenting a life Samuel had never seen. David's first steps, his first day of school, high school graduation, college, his wedding to Jennifer, birthdays and Christmases and ordinary Tuesday afternoons that would have meant everything to a father who never got the chance to witness them. "I became a teacher because of something my mother told me about my father," David said, turning to a photo of himself in his classroom. "She said he believed everyone deserved to learn, to question, to grow into who they were meant to be. I try to honor that belief every day." The weight of 30 lost years pressed down on Abram like a physical burden. This man, this good, thoughtful, loving man, should have grown up knowing his grandfather's woodworking techniques, his Aunt Martha's gentle wisdom, his cousins Rebecca and Jacob. The children should have grown up with Amish aunts and uncles, with the security of extended family, with knowledge of their heritage, even if they chose a different path. "I want you to know your cousins," Abram said suddenly. "Rebecca and Jacob. They should know they have a nephew, that these children are part of their family." David's expression grew cautious. "Would they want to know us? We're not Amish. We're never going to be Amish. Would that be enough for them?" It was a fair question, and one Abram couldn't answer with certainty. The Amish community was built on separation from the outside world, on the belief that close relationships with English families led to spiritual compromise. Bringing David and his family into their lives would challenge everything their neighbors believed about proper boundaries. But as he looked at his great-nephew and great-niece, at the echoes of Samuel in their faces and the warmth of the family they had built, Abram knew that some bonds transcended religious boundaries. "Family isn't just about sharing beliefs," he said finally. "It's about sharing love. And there's been enough separation in this family. Too much loss that didn't need to happen. David nodded slowly. I'd like that. The kids should know where they come from, even if they're growing up somewhere different. As Abram prepared to leave, Emma tugged on his coat sleeve. Will you come back and visit us again? Yes, he promised, meaning it more than any promise he had ever made. And maybe next time you can meet your cousin Rebecca and her little girl. She's about your age. But even as he made the promise, Abram wondered if he would be able to keep it. Word of his visits to the English world would not stay secret long in their close-knit community. Already he could sense the walls closing in around him, the consequences of his search for truth beginning to manifest in disapproving glances and whispered conversations. The drive home passed in contemplative silence, Tom's radio playing soft country music that reminded Abram of the songs Samuel had probably heard during his time in the outside world. By the time they reached the farm, full darkness had fallen, and the warm yellow glow from the kitchen windows seemed to belong to someone else's life, a simpler life built on simpler truths that were no longer sufficient for the man he was becoming. The manila envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous-looking teenager who pedaled away on his bicycle as soon as Abram signed for it. No return address, just his name written in careful block letters across the front. Inside, he found photocopied police reports, witness statements, and a handwritten note that made his blood run cold. Mr. Lapp, my grandfather was Officer Patrick Murphy. He worked the Samuel Lapp case in 1990. Before he died last year, he gave me these papers and made me promise to get them to Samuel's family if I ever had the chance. He said the case never sat right with him, that too many people had reason to keep the truth buried. He was right to be concerned. What happened to your brother wasn't an accident. Kevin Murphy, Abram's hands shook as he spread the documents across his workshop table. The official police report was brief, clinical, antiseptic. A young Amish man found dead in the Schuylkill River, apparent accidental drowning, case closed within 48 hours. But the witness statements told a different story. A homeless man had seen Samuel talking to two other Amish men near the river on the night he died. The conversation had been heated, voices raised, though the witness couldn't make out the words. One of the men had been older, with a grey beard, a description that matched Abram's father perfectly. The other had been younger, stockier, wearing the black coat and broad-brimmed hat of an Amish elder. There were photographs, too, crime scene images that had never been shared with the family. Samuel's body, pulled from the water, showed signs of trauma inconsistent with a simple fall. Bruises on his arms and torso, defensive wounds on his hands. The medical examiner's preliminary notes, later mysteriously altered in the final report, indicated signs of a struggle, but it was the final document that destroyed any remaining doubt about what had happened that night. A sworn statement from Officer Murphy himself, written years later and never filed officially, detailed pressure from prominent community members to close the case quickly and quietly. Phone calls from influential Amish leaders, suggestions that pursuing the investigation would damage relationships between the police and the peaceful religious community that brought tourist dollars to the region. Murphy had been a young officer then, ambitious and eager to please his superiors. He had allowed himself to be convinced that Samuel's death was better left as an accident, that digging deeper would serve no purpose except to cause pain for his grieving family. But the decision had haunted him for 30 years, and his final act had been to preserve the truth for someone who might someday have the courage to face it. Abram read through the documents 3 times, each reading confirming what he had begun to suspect since finding the barrel. Samuel had been murdered. The community leaders, including his own father, had covered it up. And he himself had been manipulated into accepting a lie that had shaped the rest of his life. The sound of buggy wheels on gravel announced visitors. Through the workshop window, Abram saw Bishop Miller and Elder Stoltzfus approaching, their faces grave with purpose. Quickly, he gathered the police documents and hid them in his tool chest, his heart pounding with the rhythm of guilt and fear. "Good morning, Abram," the bishop said as they entered the workshop. We need to speak with you about some concerning reports we've received." "What sort of reports?" Abram asked, though he suspected he already knew. "You've been seen in Lancaster," Elder Stoltzfus said without preamble, "speaking with English authorities, visiting English families. This behavior has caused considerable concern within the community." Bishop Miller stepped closer, his eyes scanning the workshop as if looking for evidence of corruption. "We understand that grief can lead a man down difficult paths, but your recent actions suggest a dangerous obsession with matters that should remain in God's hands. I've been trying to understand what really happened to my brother." Abram said carefully, "Your brother died 30 years ago," the bishop replied firmly. "He made choices that led him away from his family and his faith. His death was a tragedy, but it was also God's judgment on a life lived outside divine will." The casual dismissal of Samuel's life, the cold certainty in the bishop's voice, ignited something dangerous in Abram's chest. What if God's judgment wasn't what killed him? What if it was man's judgment instead? The two church leaders exchanged glances that confirmed Abram's worst suspicions. They knew. They had always known. "Abram," Elder Stoltzfus said slowly, "there are some truths that serve no purpose except to cause pain. Your brother's death was investigated by English authorities and found to be accidental. That should be sufficient for any faithful man, even if the investigation was influenced by members of our own community." Abram pressed. "Even if evidence was suppressed to protect certain reputations." The silence that followed was charged with 30 years of buried secrets. Bishop Miller's face had gone very pale, while Elder Stoltzfus seemed to be calculating how much Abram actually knew versus how much he was guessing. "Who have you been talking to?" the bishop asked finally. "People who knew Samuel, people who loved him, people who deserved to know the truth about how he died. The truth," Elder Stoltzfus said, his voice rising slightly, "is that Samuel Lapp chose the world over his family. He chose sin over righteousness. Whatever consequences followed from those choices were his to bear, even if those consequences included being beaten and thrown into a river to drown." The words hung in the workshop air like an accusation. Both men stared at Abram with expressions that mixed shock, anger, and something that looked like fear. "You're treading on dangerous ground," Bishop Miller said quietly, "making accusations against good men, faithful servants of God, who have spent their lives protecting this community. This obsession with the past is destroying your soul, Abram, and if you're not careful, it will destroy your family as well." The threat was clear. Continue investigating Samuel's death and face excommunication. Lose not just his place in the community, but access to his children and grandchildren. Watch everything he had built crumble because he couldn't accept comfortable lies. What really happened that night? Abram asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "I know my father was there. I know Samuel didn't die accidentally. I know you've been covering it up for 30 years. Elder Stoltzfus stepped forward, his face flushed with righteous anger. "Your father was a good man who made a difficult choice to protect his family and his community. Samuel was going to bring shame on everyone who shared his name. He had married an English woman, fathered a bastard child, and was planning to flaunt his sin before the entire district. So you killed him for it. We tried to reason with him." The words exploded from Elder Stoltzfus before he could stop them. "Your father begged him to come home, to abandon that woman and her child, to restore honor to the Lapp name. But Samuel laughed at us. He said love was more important than honor, that his son mattered more than our approval." Bishop Miller placed a warning hand on the elder's arm. But the older man was beyond caution now. He fought like a wild animal when we tried to bring him home by force. "Your father never meant for him to die. None of us did. But Samuel wouldn't listen to reason, wouldn't accept God's will for his life. And when he fell into the water, when we realized he was truly gone, your father made the decision to let God's judgment stand. The confession hung between them like a bridge that once crossed could never be uncrossed. Abram felt 30 years of grief and guilt reshaping itself into fury and determination. "My father was there when Samuel died." "You were there?" And you let everyone believe it was an accident, because the truth would have destroyed more lives than it saved, Bishop Miller said, his composure returning. Your father carried that burden for the rest of his life so that you could grow up without shame, so that your children could live without the stain of Samuel's choices. Samuel's choices. Abram's voice rose despite his efforts to control it. Samuel chose love. You chose murder. And then you spent 30 years making me believe I was somehow responsible for his death. He pulled the police documents from his tool chest, spreading them across the workbench like cards in a deadly game. Officer Murphy kept records. Real records. He knew what happened, and he preserved the evidence. Both men stared at the papers as if they were instruments of their own destruction, which Abram realized they were. The confrontation in the workshop ended with threats disguised as pastoral concern. Bishop Miller and Elder Stoltzfus left with stern warnings about the consequences of pursuing dangerous paths. But Abram saw fear in their eyes, fear that 30 years of carefully maintained lies were about to crumble into dust. That evening, alone in his workshop with Samuel's journal and Officer Murphy's evidence spread before him, Abram tried to piece together the full scope of what had happened. The conspiracy reached deeper than he had imagined. His father hadn't acted alone. Several community elders had been involved in the cover-up, possibly including the current bishop, who would have been a younger man in 1990. The sound of footsteps on the workshop stairs announced Martha's arrival. She appeared in the doorway carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression that mixed concern with determination. They came to see me after they left here, she said, setting the coffee beside him and studying the documents scattered across his workbench. Bishop Miller and Elder Stoltzfus. They're very worried about your spiritual state. I'm sure they are, Abram replied grimly. They should be worried about their own spiritual states after what they've done. Martha pulled up a stool and sat beside him, her presence both comforting and stabilizing in a world that seemed to be spinning out of control. Tell me everything, she said simply. No more half-truths or careful omissions. If we're going to face whatever comes next, I need to understand what we're really dealing with. So Abram told her about the barrel and its contents, about Sarah and David and the family they had never known existed, about the police reports and witness statements that painted a picture of murder disguised as divine judgment, about the confession he had forced from Elder Stoltzfus and the conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of their community leadership. Martha listened in silence, her face growing paler with each revelation. When he finished, she sat quietly for several minutes, staring at Samuel's photograph with the woman and baby he had loved enough to die for. Your brother was braver than I ever imagined, she said finally, and more foolish. He should have known they would never let him go peacefully. You believe me? You believe all this really happened? Martha picked up Officer Murphy's statement and read it carefully, her lips moving slightly as she processed the detailed account of evidence suppression and community pressure. I believe you've uncovered something terrible, something that changes everything we thought we knew about Samuel's death and the people we've trusted to guide our spiritual lives. She set the paper down and looked directly into his eyes. The question is, what do you plan to do about it? It was the question Abram had been avoiding since the moment he forced Elder Stoltzfus's confession. What did he plan to do? Go to the English police with 30-year-old evidence? Confront the community publicly with accusations that would tear apart families and destroy the peaceful existence they had all worked to maintain? Leave the community entirely and build a new life with the nephew and great-grandchildren he had only just discovered? I don't know, he admitted. Every choice feels like it will destroy something precious. Some things deserve to be destroyed, Martha said quietly. Some lies are too poisonous to be allowed to continue. Before Abram could respond, they heard voices approaching the workshop, multiple voices, urgent and upset. Through the window he saw lanterns bobbing in the darkness as a group of community members made their way toward his property. Word has spread, Martha observed, moving to stand beside him at the window. They know you've found something and they're afraid. The group that gathered outside the workshop included most of the church's leadership, Bishop Miller, the elders, several deacons, and a handful of influential family heads. Notably absent were the younger generation, the people who might be sympathetic to questions about traditional authority. Abram Lapp, Bishop Miller called out, his voice carrying the formal tone reserved for serious church business. We need to speak with you about the accusations you've been making against faithful members of this community. Abram stepped outside, Martha close beside him. The faces surrounding him in the lantern light were a mixture of concern, anger, and barely controlled panic. These were people he had known his entire life, people whose children played with his grandchildren, people who had been part of every important moment in his adult existence. I haven't made any accusations, Abram said carefully. I've simply been seeking the truth about my brother's death. The truth, Elder Stoltzfus said, his voice shaking with emotion, is that Samuel Lapp died because he rejected everything good and holy in his life. Whatever happened to him afterward was God's will or man's decision. Abram countered, because the evidence I've found suggests very different causes for my brother's death. A murmur went through the group as they processed his words. Some faces showed genuine shock, younger elders and deacons who might not have been privy to the full truth 30 years ago. Others, the older men who would have been in positions of authority in 1990, looked like defendants waiting for a verdict. What evidence? Asked Deacon Yoder, one of the younger men. What have you found that contradicts the official investigation? Bishop Miller shot him a sharp look, clearly preferring to handle this confrontation without input from community members who might ask uncomfortable questions. But the damage was done. Doubt had been introduced into the group dynamic. Police reports, Abram said, his voice growing stronger as he realized some of these men genuinely didn't know what had been done in their community's name. Witness statements, medical examiner's notes, all of it pointing to the fact that Samuel didn't die accidentally. Even if that were true, Bishop Miller said quickly, it happened 30 years ago. The people involved are mostly gone now. Your father, Bishop Weaver, Elder Kaufman, they've all passed on. What purpose does digging up old pain serve except to destroy the peace we've worked so hard to maintain? But Abram could see that the younger men were troubled by the implication that their spiritual leaders had been involved in covering up a possible murder. Their faith had been built on the assumption that their elders were men of unshakable integrity, that the community's moral authority was divinely ordained and humanly pure. The purpose, Abram said, looking directly at Deacon Yoder and the other younger leaders, is that Samuel left behind a family, a wife who loved him, and a son who has grown up without knowing his father's real story. They deserve the truth, even if it's painful. A son. The words came from multiple voices as the revelation rippled through the group. Samuel had a child with an English woman, Martha said, speaking for the first time since the group had arrived. Her voice was calm but firm, carrying 30 years of authority as a respected community member. That child is now a grown man with children of his own. They are Abram's family, whether you approve of how they live or not. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of implications. A living descendant of Samuel Lapp changed everything, made the past not just a historical curiosity, but a present reality with legal and moral dimensions that couldn't be ignored. Elder Stoltzfus stepped forward, his face flushed with anger and desperation. This is exactly what we feared would happen 30 years ago. Samuel's choices would contaminate our community, draw us into the English world with all its corruption and legal complications. Legal complications? Deacon Yoder's voice sharpened with understanding. Are you saying the community leadership deliberately covered up a crime to avoid English legal consequences? The older elders exchanged glances that spoke of years of shared secrets. Bishop Miller raised his hand for silence, his authority still strong enough to command temporary obedience. What happened 30 years ago was a tragedy that good men handled as best they could under difficult circumstances, he said carefully. Samuel Lapp had chosen to leave our community, to reject our ways, to live in sin with an English woman. When he died, the decision was made to handle his burial and memorial in a way that would cause the least pain to his family and the least disruption to our community, by lying about how he died. The question came from Martha, her voice cutting through the bishop's careful words like a blade. By letting his wife and child believe he had abandoned them. By allowing Abram to carry guilt for 30 years over a brother's death he had nothing to do with. Abram felt a surge of love for his wife that nearly overwhelmed him. In 32 years of marriage, he had never heard her challenge church authority so directly. But she was standing with him now, choosing truth over comfort, family over community approval. Mrs. Lapp, Bishop Miller said, his tone carrying a warning. "You're speaking of matters you don't fully understand." "Then help me understand," Martha replied. "Explain to me how good men, godly men, could decide that murder was better left unreported. Explain how protecting the community's reputation became more important than seeking justice for a young father who was trying to build a life for his family." The word murder fell among the gathered men like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock and disbelief through those who had not been part of the original conspiracy. Abram could see the community fracturing in real time, those who had known the truth facing those who had been kept in ignorance for 3 decades. "That's a serious accusation," Deacon Yoder said slowly. "Are you saying that Samuel Lapp was murdered by members of our community?" Elder Stoltzfus opened his mouth to speak, but Bishop Miller silenced him with a sharp gesture. The damage. Control was failing, secrets spilling out faster than they could be contained. "I'm saying," Abram replied, pulling Officer Murphy's statement from his jacket pocket, that a police officer who investigated Samuel's death believed there was a cover-up. That witness statements describing a violent confrontation between Samuel and 2 Amish men were suppressed. That medical evidence pointing to a struggle was ignored or altered. He held up the document for all to see. "I'm saying that my brother didn't die because he fell into a river while drunk. He died because he refused to abandon his wife and child to satisfy the community's demand for conformity." The younger men in the group pressed closer, trying to read the police statement in the flickering lantern light. Their faces showed the dawning horror of realizing that their faith community, their moral anchor, had been built on a foundation of deadly secrets. "This changes everything," Deacon Yoder whispered. "If this is true, if people in our community were involved in Samuel's death and then covered it up, we have an obligation to protect our community." Elder Stoltzfus interrupted, his composure finally cracking completely. "Samuel made his choice when he rejected everything we taught him. He chose the world over his family, sin over righteousness. What happened to him was God's judgment, and any attempt to second-guess that judgment now will only bring destruction on innocent people." "Innocent people?" Martha's voice rose with indignation. "What about Samuel's innocent wife, who spent 30 years believing her husband had abandoned her? What about his innocent son, who grew up thinking his father's family had rejected him? What about my innocent husband, who has carried guilt for his brother's death for 3 decades? The confrontation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Accusations flew back and forth, old alliances cracked under the pressure of revealed truths, and the community that had seemed so solid just hours before began to fragment along lines of knowledge and ignorance, guilt and innocence. In the midst of the chaos, Abram made his decision. The choice that had seemed impossible just minutes before suddenly became clear. Some truths were too important to remain buried, regardless of the consequences. "Tomorrow morning," he announced, his voice cutting through the arguments, "I'm taking this evidence to the Lancaster County Police. They can decide whether there's enough to reopen the investigation into Samuel's death." The declaration silenced everyone. Even the night sounds of crickets and wind seemed to pause, as if the entire world was holding its breath. "If you do that," Bishop Miller said quietly, You'll be choosing the English legal system over our community's authority. You'll be placing yourself outside our fellowship permanently, and if I don't, Abram replied, I'll be choosing comfortable lies over painful truths. I'll be betraying my brother's memory and denying his son the justice he deserves. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, some sympathetic, some hostile, all struggling to process the magnitude of what was being revealed. These were his neighbors, his friends, the people who had shaped his entire adult life. Losing them would be like losing part of himself. But keeping Samuel's secret would be losing something even more fundamental, his integrity, his honor, his ability to look at himself in the mirror and see a man worthy of respect. Then you're choosing to destroy this community, Elder Stoltzfus said, his voice heavy with finality. You're choosing to bring shame and legal trouble on innocent families for the sake of a dead man who rejected everything we hold sacred. No, Abram replied, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. I'm choosing to honor the memory of a man who died because he loved his family more than he feared your disapproval. And I'm choosing to give his son the truth about his father, even if that truth is painful. The group began to disperse, conversations fragmenting into smaller discussions as people processed what they had heard and decided where their loyalties lay. Some of the younger men approached Abram privately, expressing support for his decision and horror at what they had learned about their community's past. Others walked away without speaking, their silence more damning than any words. As the lanterns disappeared into the darkness, Abram and Martha stood alone in front of their workshop, surrounded by the familiar sounds and smells of the farm that had been their world for 30 years. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Martha asked, slipping her hand into his. Abram looked up at the stars visible through the clear autumn sky. The same stars Samuel had seen on his last night alive. The same stars that had witnessed 30 years of buried truth finally coming to light. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm ready to face it anyway." The Lancaster County Police Station felt like entering another world. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, phones rang constantly, and the air carried scents of coffee and stress that were foreign to Abram's experience. Detective Sarah Chen, a woman about Rebecca's age with kind eyes and patient manner, led him to a conference room where they could speak privately. "Mr. Lapp," she said, settling across from him at a scarred wooden table. "Officer Murphy's grandson called ahead to explain what you've brought us. I want you to know that we take any new evidence in an old case very seriously, regardless of how much time has passed." Abram spread the documents across the table. Samuel's journal, the photographs, Officer Murphy's statement, the hospital, records that showed Samuel had lived for 2 days after the reported accident. Detective Chen examined each piece of evidence carefully, taking notes and asking careful questions about how he had obtained each item. "This is substantial," she said finally. "More than enough to justify reopening the investigation. The original case file has been in storage for decades, but I can have it pulled and reviewed against this new evidence." "What happens next?" Abram asked, his voice barely steady. The magnitude of what he was setting in motion was beginning to sink in. "We'll start by interviewing everyone who was involved in the original investigation. Officers, medical examiner, staff, anyone who might remember details that didn't make it into the official reports. Then we'll need to speak with the witnesses you've identified. Samuel's wife, the homeless man who saw the confrontation, anyone else who might have relevant information." Detective Chen paused, studying Abram's face carefully. "I need to ask you directly, do you have specific information about who might have been responsible for your brother's death?" The moment Abram had been dreading had arrived. Speaking Samuel's name in this sterile room, surrounded by the apparatus of English justice, felt like crossing a bridge that could never be uncrossed. "Elder Stoltzfus confessed to being present when Samuel died," he said quietly. "He claimed it was an accident, that they were trying to bring Samuel home by force, and he fell into the water during a struggle. But the evidence suggests otherwise. And you believe there was a deliberate cover-up involving multiple people? I know there was. The bishop at the time, several elders, possibly others, they pressured the police to close the case quickly, altered evidence, and let everyone believe Samuel had died accidentally. Detective Chen made more notes, her expression growing more serious with each revelation. Mr. Lapp, I want you to understand what you're starting here. If we find evidence of criminal wrongdoing, even 30-year-old criminal wrongdoing, we'll be obligated to pursue charges against anyone who was involved. That could include people who are still alive, people who are respected members of your community. I understand, Abram replied, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. But my brother deserves justice, even if it comes 30 years too late. The investigation moved with surprising speed once Detective Chen involved the district attorney's office. Within a week, search warrants had been issued for church records, and formal interviews were scheduled with community leaders who had been in positions of authority in 1990. The reaction in the Amish community was swift and severe. Bishop Miller called a special church meeting without inviting Abram or Martha, where he announced that Abram Lapp had chosen to involve English authorities in private community matters. The vote for excommunication was unanimous among those present. The news reached Abram through Rebecca, who arrived at the farm in tears. "Dad, they're saying you're no longer welcome at church?" she sobbed, clutching little Martha to her chest, as if the baby could somehow anchor their family against the storm that was tearing it apart. "They're saying anyone who supports your investigation will face church discipline too." Abram held his daughter as she wept, feeling the weight of every choice he had made since finding that barrel in the river. His pursuit of truth was destroying the very relationships he had hoped to protect. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair. "I'm so sorry this is happening to our family." "Then stop it," Rebecca pleaded. "Tell the police you made a mistake, that you don't want to pursue this anymore. Let Samuel rest in peace and come back to us." But even as his daughter begged him to abandon his search for justice, Abram thought of David and his children, the family members who had been denied their heritage for 30 years because of lies and cover-ups. How could he choose the comfort of one family over the rights of another? "I can't," he said simply. "Some truths are too important to abandon, even when they cost us everything." The formal police interviews began the following Tuesday. Elder Stoltzfus, now in his 70s and facing the possibility of criminal charges, hired an English lawyer and refused to repeat the confession he had made in Abram's workshop. Bishop Miller maintained that he had no knowledge of any cover-up, that he had simply followed the guidance of his predecessors in handling Samuel's death. But cracks were beginning to show in the wall of silence that had protected the conspiracy for 3 decades. Younger community members, horrified by what they were learning, began to come forward with fragments of information, overheard conversations, suspicious behaviors, small details that individually meant nothing but together painted a picture of coordinated deception. The net was closing. But Abram wondered if justice delayed for 30 years could ever truly be justice at all. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Anna Stoltzfus, Elder Stoltzfus's own daughter-in-law, appeared at Abram's door on a rain-soaked Thursday morning, with a manila envelope clutched against her chest and fear written across her face. "I found this in my father-in-law's papers," she said without preamble, thrusting the envelope toward Abram. "He's been burning documents in the backyard all week, but he missed this one. I think you need to see it." Inside was a deed, the original property transfer that had established the Lapp family farm. But this wasn't the deed Abram remembered seeing in his father's papers. This version showed that Samuel had been granted joint ownership of the farm when he turned 18, making him a legal co-owner with full inheritance rights. "Samuel owned half of this land," Anna whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder as if afraid of being overheard. "If he was married when he died, if he had a child, then Then David has a legal claim to the property, Abram finished, the implications hitting him like a thunderbolt. The deed changed everything. It provided a motive for murder that went beyond religious disapproval. Elder Stoltzfus and the other conspirators hadn't just been protecting community standards. They had been protecting valuable farmland from falling into English hands through Samuel's widow and child. Detective Chen was ecstatic when Abram presented the deed. "This gives us grounds for a financial motive," she explained. "Land fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, possibly even first-degree murder if we can prove premeditation." But the revelation also triggered a cascade of consequences that Abram hadn't anticipated. If David had inheritance rights to half the Lapp farm, then Abram's own children's futures were suddenly uncertain. The property they had expected to inherit, the land their great-grandfather had cleared with his own hands, might legally belong to a nephew they had never met. The community's reaction was swift and brutal. Families who had been friends for generations suddenly found themselves on opposite sides of an increasingly bitter divide. Those who supported Abram's quest for justice faced social ostracism from those who believed he was destroying their peaceful way of life for the sake of ancient grievances. Jacob surprised everyone by standing firmly with his father. If Uncle Samuel was murdered, then the people responsible need to face consequences, he declared at a community meeting that Abram was forbidden to attend. Faith without justice isn't faith at all. It's just comfortable self-deception. His words cost him his position as a junior deacon and his engagement to Mary Yoder, whose father forbade the marriage to anyone from the rebellious Lappi family. But Jacob seemed oddly liberated by the break from community expectations. Maybe Uncle Samuel was right, he told Abram one evening as they worked together in the workshop that might soon belong to someone else. Maybe there's more to life than doing what we're told, because that's how it's always been done. The arrests came on a grey November morning. Elder Stoltzfus was charged with voluntary manslaughter and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Bishop Miller was charged as an accessory after the fact. Two other elders, now in their 80s, were charged with conspiracy and evidence tampering. The sight of Amish men in handcuffs being led away by English police officers sent shockwaves through the community. Some families began making plans to leave Lancaster County entirely, seeking Amish settlements where they could escape the scandal that was destroying their reputation for peaceful, law-abiding faith. But the most devastating consequence was yet to come. David Brennan, armed with the deed proving his father's ownership rights and accompanied by a Philadelphia lawyer who specialized in inheritance disputes, filed a legal claim for half of the Lapp family farm. "I don't want to hurt you," David told Abram during a tense meeting in the lawyer's office. "You're my family, and I never want to be the cause of you losing your home. But my father's property rights were stolen from him, and by extension from me. I need those rights recognized." The lawyer suggested a compromise. David would deed his inherited land back to Abram and Martha in exchange for a cash settlement that reflected the property's current value. It was a reasonable proposal, but it required selling most of the farm to raise the money. 30 years ago, they killed my father to keep this land in the community, David said quietly. Now that same land might be the only way to get justice for what they did to him. The irony was bitter, but undeniable. Samuel had died because he chose love over land, family over property, truth over tradition. Now his son was claiming that same land not out of greed, but as a form of justice, a way of forcing the community to pay a tangible price for the choices their leaders had made 3 decades earlier. As Abram sat in that sterile conference room, surrounded by English lawyers and legal documents that would determine his family's future, he wondered if this was what Samuel would have wanted. Justice served, but at the cost of destroying the very community they had both grown up loving, despite its flaws. 6 months later, Abram stood in the doorway of David's house in Philadelphia, holding a family Bible that had belonged to his grandfather. Inside the front cover, he had carefully written the names and dates that had been missing for 30 years. Samuel Lapp, Married to Sarah Brennan, February 12, 1989. David Samuel Lapp, born October 15th, 1989. Emma Rose Lapp, born March 3rd, 2017. Samuel David Lapp, born June 8, 2020. The legal settlement had been finalized the week before. David had accepted a cash payment for his inheritance rights, allowing Abram and Martha to keep the family farm, though they had sold half the acreage to raise the money. The reduced property was still enough to support them in their later years. Still enough to pass on to Rebecca and Jacob if they chose to. Stay, but the community they had known was gone. Forever. Elder Stoltzfus had been convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years in prison, a term that would likely mean he would die behind bars. Bishop Miller had accepted a plea deal, serving 6 months in county jail in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation. The scandal had split the church community down the middle, with some families leaving Lancaster County entirely while others worked to rebuild their faith on more honest foundations. "The children are in the backyard," David said, leading Abram through the house that had become a second home over the past months. "Emma's been practicing the woodworking techniques you taught her last visit. In the garden, behind the row house, 8-year-old Emma looked up from the small birdhouse she was sanding, her face lighting up with joy at seeing her great-uncle. Little Sam, now 5 and no longer shy around the tall man with the grey beard, ran to wrap his arms around Abram's legs. "Gross Daddy," he called out, using the Pennsylvania Dutch word for grandfather that Abram had taught him. "Look what I made!" The wooden horse was rough but recognizable, carved with the patient hands of a child learning to shape wood into something beautiful. Abram examined it carefully, praising the smooth curves and suggesting gentle improvements, just as his own grandfather had done with his first clumsy attempts at woodworking. "Your father would be proud," he told the boy, and meant it completely. Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of lemonade, her hair now completely silver, but her smile unchanged from the photographs Samuel had treasured. She had embraced Abram and Martha as the family she had always hoped to have, never showing resentment for the 30 years of separation that hadn't been their fault. "Any word from Rebecca?" she asked, settling into a chair beside Martha, who was holding Emma's latest drawing, a picture of the entire extended family standing together in front of both the farm and the Philadelphia house. "She and David are coming for dinner next week," Martha replied. "And she's bringing little Martha. I think she's finally ready to let the baby know her great-uncle Samuel's story." It had taken time for Abram's children to accept their new reality. Rebecca had struggled with the idea that her father's quest for truth had destroyed their community, standing, and reduced their inheritance. Jacob had surprised everyone by thriving in the aftermath of the scandal, using his freedom from community constraints to explore new ideas and possibilities. "I've been thinking about Samuel a lot lately," David said, joining them in the garden. "About the choice he made to stay in this world instead of returning to yours. I used to think it was about rejecting his upbringing, but now I understand it was about embracing something new." Abram nodded, thinking about all the choices they had all made in recent months. His own choice to pursue truth regardless of consequences. Martha's choice to stand with him despite the cost. Rebecca's choice to gradually accept her expanded family despite her initial resistance. Jacob's choice to question everything he had been taught to accept without examination. "Your father wasn't running away from his family," Abram said. "He was running toward a different kind of family, one built on choice rather than obligation, love rather than duty." As the afternoon wore on, they shared stories and planned futures that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier. Emma would spend part of the summer at the farm, learning traditional crafts and helping with the garden. Sam would visit his great-grandmother Martha, who had promised to teach him to bake bread the way her own grandmother had shown her. David had been offered a teaching position at a school closer to Lancaster County, making regular visits easier. Sarah spoke of finally visiting Samuel's grave, of placing flowers on the marker that had stood alone for 30 years. "Do you ever regret it?" David asked, as the evening shadows lengthened across the small garden. Everything you gave up to find the truth about my father? Abram considered the question seriously. He had lost his church community, his standing as a respected elder, the easy certainty that had guided his entire adult life. Many of his oldest friendships had been destroyed, and his remaining years would be spent rebuilding rather than simply maintaining the life he had worked so hard to create. But as he watched his great-grandchildren playing in the gathering dusk, as he listened to Sarah and Martha planning holiday visits, as he felt the weight of the family Bible that now contained all their names, he knew his answer. "I regret how long it took me to find it," he said finally. "But I'll never regret choosing truth over comfortable lies. Some things are worth any price." The stars were beginning to appear in the Philadelphia sky, the same stars that shone over the Lancaster County farm where Samuel was buried. The same stars that had witnessed 30 years of buried secrets finally brought to light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to build something honest and lasting from the ruins of old deceptions. But tonight, for the first time in 30 years, the Lapp family was finally complete.